All right, we are back with a new video, and today I'm going to be talking about my personal thoughts on Survivor 42 now that it is wrapped up. And I think this was an all right season. I mean, on the whole, I did like it, and there are things about it that I do enjoy. Even so, I feel like this season isn't exceptional by any means. I know there are plenty of people that say that this is an all time great season. I'm not quite there, and I know there are other people that aren't, but we'll get more into that in a bit. But as usual with these reviews, what I like to do is divide into four sections. I talk about the cast in one section, production in another, editing presentation in the third, and then finally I like to talk about gameplay. But without further ado, let's get right into the review. So first up, we have the cast, and I feel like this was a pretty good cast for the most part, where it was a very likable group of people, and I feel like the show did a good job at giving us some information about each of them so that we feel like we know a lot of these people. I mean, if we're going to the cast, I mean, Marianne, of course, is a pretty big character. I really enjoyed seeing her and her energy. Mike was another very interesting character with a very interesting arc, rise and fall over the season. Same thing with Jonathan. I feel like Jonathan had a very interesting arc during the season with him being propped up initially as being this big physical guy, only to get undercut later on as more of his flaws became apparent. I felt like that was a very unusual edit for someone of his archetype to get. Omer, of course, was a pretty notable character as well, being a decoy winner, and I felt like he gave a lot of pretty interesting confessionals, and he got a lot of great personal content about him being Muslim, which was pretty needed representation on the show. High had his moments. I mean, he was a bit boring at points with him being Gamebot, but I feel like he had some very memorable confessionals as well. And even Roxroy, I mean, even though Roxroy didn't really amount to much compared to some of the other people, I feel like he was an interesting character and he had some pretty fun reactions from the jury as well. And it's the same thing with Tori. I mean, I feel like Tori was probably a bigger character, definitely one of the bigger characters on Ika in during at the game, and she had a very fun story outline throughout the season. And if we're even going back to the pre-merge, I feel like they're admittedly aren't as interesting characters, but you obviously have Daniel. I mean, I already talked about before how Daniel is a character I relate a lot to, and it was very interesting seeing his rise and fall during the season, and just seeing him blow up his game was very interesting to see, but also him getting plenty of personal content and positivity along the way was interesting to see. We also have Zach, who was a fun character in the premiere, had a very big flame out, I guess, though probably not as bad as some of the others from past seasons. And then even Jackson, I mean, the first boot of the season, I mean, he obviously got to talk a bit about his story of him transitioning only to get medevac, which was a bit of a shame, but it was obviously necessary. So I feel like on the whole, this cast was pretty good, and I feel like it's around the same level as 41 in terms of its cast. Again, lots of likable characters, and I feel like the show really utilized them about as well as they could have, all things considered. And I felt like everyone got at least something, even if it wasn't a ton, that really made them stand out in some way or another. So on the whole, I feel like the cast was definitely a strength for the season. Now we're moving on to production. This is mainly involving the format changes and any twists that they included. And obviously they brought back pretty much all the twists from 41. And on paper, one of the appeals from the season was seeing them play out differently, or if they play out the same, comparing them to 41. And I feel like a theme with this season, and I touched upon a little bit in the cast section, but I feel like 42 very much feels like a counterpiece to 41. I mean, they feel very similar seasons, and it's very interesting to see how similarly they play out, but also get some of the differences. So obviously, I'm just going to go through each of the twists that they have, similar to my 41 review. I'm just going to give my thoughts on how they played out this season. So first up, we had the summit, and didn't feel like it took up as much screen time per se as 41. I think that mainly came from the lack of meaningful cross-tribal relationships that came from it, unlike, say, Shan and Liana's relationship in 41. But it was interesting to see people actually losing their votes from the prisoner's dilemma, even that stemmed from a pretty poor read on Chanel's end. On the other hand, obviously that misread led to a pretty crazy tribal with the Jenny boot, so I guess it's at least a plus, but on the whole, I mean, I didn't really care too much for it, and I actually kind of forgot at some points that was even there, so, I mean, I feel like it's just kind of whatever. Next up, we had the Beware advantage coming back, and again, I feel like this was definitely helped by the fact that they didn't have to explain as much. And I feel like it kind of played a bigger role in the story this time. I mean, obviously, it didn't have the big oomph that 41 did, with Nasir revealing that he had found the Luvu one. And it was this big surprise. But even so, we got some interesting stuff here with Mike finding it early on, him not having his vote at the tribal they go to, which again contributed to that crazy tribal. And of course, in general on Vati, like people like Daniel and Chanel like playing around with his fate in the game. I found that was pretty interesting. Moving on to Shot in the Dark. I still like this twist. I mean, and I like the fact that we saw it get played more this season, even no one ended up getting saved by it. Now, I'm not exactly sure why it was played more. I mean, it is possible that the producers simply explained it better to the cast this time, and through that, they probably just felt more emboldened to use it. However, it's also possible that the players were just really bad at blindsiding people and making the boots feel comfortable there to where they probably felt like they were in danger more and that they needed to play the shot in the dark. Whereas in 41, like you saw on Ua, Shan really making feel a lot of those boots there feel like they were her number one, to where they didn't feel like they needed to play the shot in the dark only to be voted out there. So in general, I'm glad we saw it come into play more. And really, out of all these twists, this is definitely my favorite and one that I've definitely liked to see again. So obviously, I hope that it stays moving forward. Next up, we have the Knowledge is Power, which came back into play. This time coming simply at the merge, and I found it interesting how, unlike in 41, where it was found during the summit or gotten as a result of the summit, this time we simply saw Drea find it around camp. And I do like how they try to have it be like being caught red-handed with her having to stick her hand into the blood. I found that was pretty interesting. And I think it was sort of interesting too how Drea was able to hold on to it as long as she did. And obviously have her storyline of her having all these advantages. But obviously the main appeal is that this ended up playing the exact same way as last time, where Drea tells Omer about it, and she actually did a better job at keeping the information to herself this time than in 41 with Eliana, where basically Shan just spilt the beans to everyone, and then obviously it just spread around the entire camp, making it very easy to counter. This time, Drea only told Omer about it, but obviously that was a mistake, and that Omer ended up telling Mike about it, and they were able to counter it anyway. And obviously that is a net positive, and I do like how they revealed it this time with like her asking Mike if he has an idol, and then him saying no, which obviously was confusing in the moment. But then Jeff says he is telling the truth, and then we get that flashback. So again, I feel like it led to another pretty good moment there, and obviously it was a pretty fun downfall for Drea to be voted out immediately afterwards. Next up, we have the Hourglass twist. And obviously, this was pretty underwhelming this time. Obviously, in 41, Erika's was the one to get it. And this was sort of presented as her coming out moment. And with it being circumstantial, it obviously prolonged the time in which it took people to figure out that she was the winner. But this time, I mean, it was Roxroy getting it. And no one was expecting Roxroy to win, especially after how bad of an edit he got in the pre-merge. Though it was interesting comparing his edit during the segment with Erika's, but ultimately, I don't think the execution really affected the gameplay. But to be fair, I mean, the fact that 41's merge turned out so crazy was the result of this perfect storm, with the Hourglass simply being one part of them. But obviously, this time, I mean, the Hourglass didn't really shake up things too much. It led to a pretty straightforward vote. So, on the whole, I don't really feel like it was much of a plus there. Next up, we have the Split Tribal, aka the Teen Twist. And this was pretty straightforward for the most part. I mean, I had a feeling coming in that obviously with a flip happening, that it wouldn't have happened during the split tribal. It would have caused the majority to simply rely on easy votes for at least one more round, and then immediately afterwards there'd be sort of a flip. And that did happen here, but it obviously made for two pretty straightforward tribals, at least as far as the boots are concerned. I mean, Roxroy goes. And then afterwards, we do have an interesting discussion at Tribal that eventually lead to the Tory boot, and then Drea and Marianne playing their idols. But ultimately, I mean, the actual boot itself wasn't too interesting. So yes, while it did lead to an interesting conversation, which was contributed by the fact that they didn't see Rockstar getting voted out. I mean, obviously, that is kind of a plus, but at the end of the day, it's not too big gameplay wise. And then finally, there's the other twist to come back from 41 is Do or Die. It's something that I made a video about during the airing of the season. And somehow this ended up playing the exact same as 41, which I was very surprised by. I mean, I said this in my 41 review, and I said it in passing during the 42 power rankings, but I really thought the person that got this twist was going to be get the bad option here. Now, some of that was due to the probability factor, given the unlikelihood of the good option being picked twice in a row, especially when neither person decided to switch their box, which is the optimal strategy there. But even while watching the Do or Die episode, I really thought it was going to happen, especially when the victim turned out to be Lindsay of all people. But thankfully I was wrong, and we didn't have to see someone's game come to an end here. Now I really hope they don't bring this one back moving forward, and as of recording this, we haven't gotten confirmation that it will, but who knows? Maybe the showrunners want to wait until this draws some blood, but I mean, I kind of hope it doesn't. So, but on the whole, it's still a bad twist. Hope it doesn't come back. And then finally, they had a new twist from this season, and that being the amulets. And coming in, I wasn't really sure what to make of them. I felt like they had some potential with them being a way of building cross-tribal alliances, which again is very critical for a season with no swaps. But also posed some interesting gameplay with the amulet holders potentially targeting each other at the merge. But honestly, I felt they were pretty underwhelming in execution. They didn't seem to factor too much into the gameplay, or if they did, they were more of a secondary concern than anything else. And through that, I feel like this was kind of a wash. Now, I am not opposed to them bringing this back in the future, but I feel like on this season at least, they were a bit disappointing. So on the whole, I feel like production on this season was pretty similar to 41, and I'm kind of glad that they didn't have to take as much time to explain all these twists as obviously we saw them on 41. There isn't need to explain them again. And it was interesting seeing like the shot in the dark being played more, comparing Erica and Roxbury's edits during the Hourglass twist, and then seeing these parallels like the Do or Die, Knowledge is Power playing out similarly. But on the whole, I mean, I feel like this whole like collection of format changes and twists from 41 into 42 is a bit of a mixed bag, and I'm very interested to see how production switches it up in 43 and beyond. Now we're moving on to editing and presentation. And to me, I mean, this is definitely something that gets praised a lot by a lot of people. And to be fair, I will be giving its praise as well. However, it's certainly not perfect. I'll start with the positives though. And I think for one, this season definitely benefits from not having to explain all the twists again, which leaves more time for gameplay and getting to know these characters, which obviously leads into the biggest strengths of this edit is that it characterizes the players very well. The edit does a great job at giving everyone at least some personal content to where I feel like I know something about each of them. I know 41 was already a big step in this direction, but 42 certainly handles it better in my opinion. Along those lines, it made it so that the winner wasn't super obvious on the offset. I remember watching the first 2 or so episodes and not having a clear idea of who was the frontrunner, considering a lot of people were getting personal content instead of for storylines. You know, I think it says something when the show made me believe Roxroy and Daniel were serious contenders early on. So I feel like that's definitely a strength of the edit in that it was relatively balanced. And on a similar note, I mean, Marianne's winner edit was a bit more noticeable this time, at least while I was watching it. Now, I know people talk about how Erica came out of nowhere on 41 and was a complete shocker, but I feel like in hindsight, the pieces to that were definitely there. I mean, Erica talked about how she was going to be a lamb and lay back only to jump out later and become a lion, and that's exactly what she did. There was a reason why her edit was the way it was. It was simply other factors like Yase being the complex tribe and Luvu getting minimal content in the pre-merge that made me and a lot of other people not take that storyline seriously at the time. And it was around the final 8 when all the big contenders were either eliminated or severely undermined the edit that Erica really started to fall into place. But this time, Marianne had more things going in her favor from earlier on. She had a solid premiere talking about how she's a weird kid and wants to win to show that people like her can win. She was on Taku, the complex tribe. She has multiple confessionals about how she wants to have fun and is treating everything like an experience to the point where it becomes part of her storyline. She has well-defined relationships, particularly a rivalry with Jonathan and a bond with Romeo as underdogs. And finally, there is setup early on to her eventually flipping on Taku, culminating in her orchestrating a blindside against Omer, who was set up as the biggest player of the season. Aside from there being other contenders like Mike and Omer for much of the season, I think the biggest hesitancy I had with labeling Marianne a top contender earlier on is the fact that she was a big character. I mean, I feel like she was being set up to be a fan favorite early on, kind of like with Rupert and Pearl Islands, just to name an example. Someone that definitely gets far and would be beloved by the casual fans, but wouldn't have the actual win in her. But over time, her edits started to make more sense, and I feel like by the end, she was the pretty clear frontrunner to win. So, on the whole, I feel like, yes, I understand why people complain about the Erica winter edit, but this was definitely an upgrade in terms of us being able to analyze it and really understand its moving components. I feel like when it comes to showing people like tropes of a winter edit, I feel like Marianne's definitely falls in more in line with that than what you would see with Erica. So that is a positive in my opinion. Now, with that said, I think there are some downsides to the edit, namely with how I feel it presented the gameplay. Now, to be fair, I will be talking about the gameplay in a moment and how I don't think it was super interesting for the most part. However, I feel like a lot of the boots from the season were pretty foreshown from early on, making the episodes feel pretty boring. I mean, the Mariah boot was pretty obvious, the Daniel boot was obvious, the Lydia boot was obvious, the Chanel boot was obvious, the Roxroy boot was obvious. I mean, even the High and Omer boots, which should have been these massive blindsides, I mean, I saw them coming from a mile away. And even in the end game, like with Lindsay, like I had a feeling Lindsay was going to go if she didn't win the Final Five immunity. And obviously that ended up happening. So I feel like in terms of the gameplay, it didn't really do a good job at throwing us for a loop. I feel like the only times where I didn't feel 100% confident about who was going home in each episode was either when something happened at Tribal that directly affected the outcome, like with the Jenny boot and then later with the Tori boot, or it was something in which I was simply overthinking it and I assumed that they were going to try to blindside us, only to go with the more obvious thing by the end of it. So I do consider that a bit of a downside in the edit in that it made it a bit more predictable. And I guess that can tie into the Marianne winner edit being a bit of a negative in that, yes, it is something that we can chew on, but it is also something that makes her a bit more prevalent, especially in hindsight. So that's definitely a factor. But all things considered, I do think the show was presented pretty well in the season with some pretty strong and balanced editing throughout. And I feel like we definitely got to know a lot of these people pretty well. And again, while the gameplay wasn't presented as super interesting, I think some of that does also tie into the fact that the gameplay itself isn't super interesting. But all things considered, the editing here is pretty solid. And finally, we have to talk about the gameplay. And to me, this is where 42 really takes a step down from 41, in my opinion. Now, the actual gameplay of this season just wasn't as interesting as 41's. Now, granted, I don't think 41 was super dynamic or anything, but I feel like 42 is probably a worse version of 41, all things considered. And I think this season really highlights the flaws with this new era format of 3 tribes, no swaps, and weird twists taking up much of the post merge. I mean, the pre merge was pretty lackluster with there being a lack of blindsides and interesting vote outs. I mean, both the Zach and Mariah votes were pretty straightforward, with them even being the first truly unanimous nonverbal votes in Survivor history, or at least according to the Survivor Wiki. The Swati blindside was also pretty tame, and while the Daniel round could have been interesting, I mean, once it came out as a tie, I was pretty confident he was going home on the revote. The only truly interesting round in the pre-merge is the Jenny round, with a deadlock vote, the possibility of rocks, and Daniel just blowing up his game. But even that tribal, I feel like, was largely facilitated by twists. I mean, I felt like it really depended upon people having their votes taken away. But I feel like that if it were a regular vote where everyone was involved, it would have been a straight up Lydia blindside. So I feel like on the whole, these small tribes don't really cater themselves towards interesting vote outs in a lot of scenarios. And from what I understand, I think 43 is going back to 3 tribes, which is a bit unfortunate, but hopefully we'll get more dynamic gameplay in the pre-merge. And the post-merge has pretty similarities to 41 as well, where it definitely starts out with the big majority alliance coming together and giving us several boring rounds, which aren't helped by the weird format of certain rounds, encouraging those people to play it safe. I mean, obviously, it eventually crackers at the final 8, but first we had to get through the hourglass twist, which again, I mean, limits the options in terms of people who can be voted out. Again, encouraging them to play it safe. I mean, we obviously have the actual merge was pretty standard with the Chanel boot. Obviously, it was very boring. We get to the split tribal where, again, I mean, you think this would be a point in the game where people would be encouraged to flip a bit or causing people the majority alliance to fracture. But again, with the split tribal, it just encourages people to play it safe. I mean, we get the Roxroy boot, which is very boring. And then the Tori boot, which came immediately after. I mean, that could have been an interesting blindside, but obviously, I mean, outside circumstances took precedence there to where Marianne and Drea play their idols, but it also made it very obvious Tori was going home there. And then even at the final eight, where we get the high vote, I mean, despite seeming interesting on the surface, I don't think it really changed much as the Taku 4 were clearly out in front at that point. They were clearly the core and the majority there. And I feel like by taking out high, they were simply just reinforcing their dominance per se. Now, fortunately, I think the final seven is where the game starts to pick up. Now, even then, I mean, the do or die almost ruined it, of course. But we do get that interesting vote of Omer telling Mike about Drea's knowledge is power, allowing them to counter it and send out Drea. I mean, that was pretty fun. Then we get the final six where we have Marianne pulling together the outsiders to blindside Omer, the biggest player in the game. And while it's dumb that Lindsay doesn't play her idol on Omer when it was her last opportunity to do so, it's still a good moment nonetheless. Final five is a bit boring where it's a straightforward Lindsay vote, although it was kind of interesting seeing Marianne at least considering working to save her. Plus, you have Mike playing his idol on Marianne, while Marianne got to keep her idol secret, which was something, I guess. Oh, and there's Romeo having a fake idol and him sounding like he fooled everyone with it, even though everyone knew it was fake, so pretty pointless, but also kind of funny. Then at the final four, you have Mike playing games to try to not go into fire, only to go into fire anyway and beating Jonathan. Then we get the final tribal, which was fine. I mean, it was interesting to learn that Mike had a shot to win, where we know people like Lindsay and Roxroy were considering voting for him, but then he just blows it, trying to preach on honor and integrity when it's clear that the jury just wasn't having it. Meanwhile, I think Marianne gave a pretty strong performance where she articulated her game pretty well, like how she knows that young players, especially young women, tend to get targeted early for coming off as strategic. I mean, I thought that was pretty good. Taking credit for the Omer blindside, having decent relationships with most of the endgamers, and then her pulling out her idol in the middle of Final Tribal, which definitely impressed a lot of the people and really swayed a lot of the jury in her favor. And then through that, Marianne ends up winning in a 7-1 vote there. So again, another interesting parallel there. And on that note, let's talk about Marianne as a winner, where there's obviously plenty of parallels between Marianne and Erica. I mean, just on the surface, I mean, you have them winning in a 7-1 vote. They're also a woman of color, with Marianne even being the first black woman to win since Vesepia, so that's something at least. And obviously, they're both Canadian, which is interesting considering this is only the third season to be open to Canadian players, and yet we've already gotten two Canadian winners in a row. So obviously, those are pretty interesting parallels there. But then even extended to the game itself, I mean, like Erica, Marianne got off to a pretty rough start where people instantly saw her as a threat due to her energy and likability. She's a target at the first tribal they attend, and while she's saved there, she isn't in a great spot moving forward. I feel like it had Taku gone back to tribal before the merge, she definitely wouldn't have been an option there. Now, there is a chance they could vote out Jonathan, given Lindsay didn't like him at that point, and there was the possibility of Jonathan being seen as a threat in the post merge, but still not ideal for her. I mean, at the merge, again, similar to Erica, she's in the majority alliance through the Taku 4, and while she isn't in the driver's seat for a lot of those votes, I mean, Omer was planning to take her to 4 along with Lindsay and Romeo. Now, granted, that wouldn't have been a good position as I feel like she struggles to win against Omer or Lindsay, but it shows that she at least had a genuinely strong bond with those two people driving the game. Now, obviously, her big move is at the final 6, where she technically isn't the first one to mention blindsiding Omer. I mean, we do hear Mike talking about it first, but she does put together the split vote plan, and she ultimately gets the bulk of the credit for the move. Now, with that said, a lot of people have hailed this as an all-time great move and how this was the first time in Survivor history where the extra vote mattered. I mean, it's a good move and probably the best move of the season, but all-time great move is a bit much. I mean, and I also think the extra vote thing is a bit overblown, where yes, Marianne's extra vote is what seals the Omer boot, technically speaking, but even if Marianne didn't have her extra vote, I mean, Omer goes out anyway, as Mike was in on the split vote plan, and on the revote, he would have no reason to not pull the trigger on Omer, as the only hesitation he had on voting Omer before Tribal was the possibility of Lindsay playing her idol, which obviously wouldn't matter in the revote. So while it is a good move, I mean, it's not an all-time great one. But like Erica, I feel like this allows her to be in a bit of a power player in the end game. I mean, at 5, she makes a correct decision voting out Lindsay, and she has Mike play his idol on her, even though she didn't need it. And then at 4, Romeo wins immunity and saves her from fire. And while she gives a great final tribal performance, she wasn't guaranteed to win coming in, which is definitely a knock compared to Erica, where I feel like Erica was pretty secure in her win upon getting to final tribal, where Marianne needed a strong final tribal performance to sway a lot of those jury members in her favor, especially when they were considering voting for Mike over her. So on the whole, I don't think it's an overly impressive game as she's rarely dictating the votes. I mean, while she is in the majority for most of the post merge, I feel like Omer, Lindsay, and Mike were more instrumental in how the game is playing out. In fact, I can't even consider her a second in command, as it seems like the main reason she was as good in a good position as he was is due to Tataku 4. And even then, I assume Omer wanted to take her deep into the game because he thought she would be easy to beat. Now, obviously, she ends up outplaying him, which is pretty impressive, but I'm not entirely clear who would win an Omer Marion final tribal. I mean, I assume Marion Omer would go in with the advantage. This, along with her being in a bad spot for most of the pre-merge, makes it hard for me to assess her too highly. Again, I feel like her and Erica have a lot of similarities in their game, and I mean, admittedly, I have gone up on Erica over time, but even then, I wouldn't consider Erica a overly great winner either. And obviously, that extends to Marianne, but she definitely has some merits to her game, and she definitely has some pros to where I wouldn't consider the very bottom, and she's definitely above certain winners that, I mean, have come from before her. But even so, it's not a great win, but it is satisfying enough for this season. So all things considered, I feel like the gameplay here just wasn't as strong as 41, although there are plenty of parallels, and I think there are some interesting moments along the way, and it leads to a very similar winner as 41, at least in my opinion. But on the whole, it's not an overly big strength of the season. So to wrap up this review, I think Survivor 42 is a good season, and there are definitely things about it that I enjoy. However, I don't think it's going to be as well remembered moving forward. I mean, yes, it's going to be lumped in with 41 as being part of this new era. However, I feel like 41 is probably going to stand out more in that it was the season that introduced all this stuff, and it has like stuff like the Erica win that people will be talking about. This season is definitely good, and it definitely will have some interesting aspects to it, especially if it ends up having returning players moving forward. But I feel like it probably won't be as well remembered as 41. But not to say that's a bad season, like I still think it has a strong cast, and I feel like it definitely improves upon the editing. But all things considered, I feel like the gameplay just wasn't as strong, and I feel like it led to a pretty standard season when we really look at it. So there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. And next week, I plan to do a player ranking for this season. So rating these people based on their games. So that should be pretty fun. And as we are moving into a bit of the slow period, I feel like this was definitely a good time to produce some regular videos, some general Survivor videos, maybe some brand steals. So stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.